Imagine you're Alexander Sterling, a billionaire titan whose life is a chessboard where you are always the king. At a glittering Chicago gala, your best friend Julian issues a $1 million challenge: marry a woman who isn't a supermodel, someone completely outside your polished world, and stay married for 6 months. The target, Isabella Rossi, a woman of unshakable confidence and a spirit you can't seem to break. You accept seeing it as just another acquisition. But what happens when the pawn begins to outplay the king? What devastating secret from her past is connected to your own ruthless rise to power? Can a union born from a cynical bet transform into something real, or will the ghosts of the past destroy any chance of a future? But before we unravel this intricate game of power, revenge, and unexpected love, please subscribe to our channel for more captivating tales. And tell us in the comments where you're joining us from today. Join us to see if Alexander Sterling and Isabella Rossi can find redemption, or if some wounds are too deep to ever truly heal. Alexander Sterling. A man forged in the crucible of corporate warfare, was wealthy, arrogant, and accustomed to victory. Competition was the air he breathed, the fuel that propelled his empire. So when his closest friend Julian presented a bold challenge amidst the clinking glasses and muted chatter of a lavish Chicago party, Alexander was intrigued. Julian smirked, a glint of mischief in his eyes. "Let's see if you can win this one, Alex. I bet you wouldn't have the guts to marry a woman who doesn't fit your usual type." Alexander, known for a revolving door of impossibly beautiful women, was taken aback, but the instinct to prove himself was overpowering. He raised a single questioning eyebrow. "And the prize?" With a triumphant grin, Julian raised his champagne flute. $1 million to the winner, but you have to marry her and stay married for at least 6 months. Feeling the familiar rush of competition and the trivial appeal of the financial stake, Alexander agreed without a moment's hesitation. The woman Julian had in mind was Isabella Rossi, someone who defied conventional standards of beauty. Alexander didn't know her, but to him she was merely the objective in another deal to be won. Days later, Alexander received a dossier on Isabella. She was confident, fiercely independent, and strong-willed, nothing like the pliant women he was used to. This detail, far from deterring him, only sharpened his interest. Accustomed to being the master of every situation, he wondered how he would handle someone who refused to bend to his will. Their first meeting was staged at a luxurious Michelin-starred restaurant. When Isabella arrived, Alexander immediately noted how profoundly different she was from anyone he had ever encountered. She seemed utterly unintimidated by the opulent setting or by Alexander himself. Instead, she met his calculated gaze with a firm, unflinching confidence. "You must be Alexander Sterling," Isabella said directly as she sat, her voice even and clear. "And you must be Isabella Rossi," Alexander replied, with a controlled, practiced smile, extending his hand. She hesitated for a brief, telling moment before shaking it, her grip strong, telegraphing her determination. "Let's not beat around the bush." Isabella began, her tone straightforward. "I know why we're here. I know about the bet, the terms, the conditions." Alexander was surprised by her bluntness, but masked it expertly. "And yet you still agreed to meet," he probed, genuinely curious about her motivations. Isabella paused, considering her words. "Let's just say I have my reasons," she answered. "I'm not naive, Alexander. 6 months may seem short, but a lot can change in that time. If you think you can manipulate or control me, you're mistaken." Alexander smiled. Isabella was proving to be more of a challenge than he had anticipated, which only made the game more interesting. As their first meeting concluded, Alexander found himself increasingly intrigued. She was not afraid of him, and that piqued a strange mix of curiosity and even a flicker of admiration. Days passed, and Alexander found himself strategizing his next move. He was used to being the master of the game, but it was clear Isabella had her own rule book. Their second meeting took place at a simple neighborhood cafe, a far cry from the glamorous restaurants Alexander frequented. Isabella had suggested the spot, and Alexander, driven by curiosity, had agreed. He wanted to understand who she was and why she would consent to what was, in essence, a temporary contract of marriage. When Alexander arrived, Isabella was already there, sipping a cup of tea with a calm smile. She greeted him warmly, the chill from their first encounter having thawed slightly, though she still carried herself with that same unshakable confidence. "I thought you preferred five-star restaurants," Isabella teased as he sat down. "Sometimes it's good to break the routine," Alexander replied, trying to sound casual, though he felt distinctly out of his element. They chatted for a while, exchanging superficial details, but Isabella soon steered the conversation to the point. "If we're really going through with this, I want to make a few things clear," she said, placing her cup firmly on the table. "I'm not interested in your money or your luxury lifestyle. 6 months is 6 months, and I plan on walking away from this exactly the same as I entered." Alexander watched her carefully. He knew she was being honest. Isabella was the type of woman who knew what she wanted, and clearly marriage was not something she saw as a means to climb the social ladder. "So, what do you want?" Alexander asked, his curiosity genuine. "Freedom," she answered without hesitation. "I want you to know that even though we're entering into this agreement, I will not be controlled by you. I have my own life, and that is not going to change because of a temporary marriage." Alexander smiled. It wasn't the answer he expected, but he didn't mind granting her this freedom. To him, the marriage was a formality to win a bet. If she wanted to maintain her independence, it wouldn't bother him. "Fine," Alexander agreed. 6 months. After that, we go our separate ways." Isabella watched him for a moment, as if wanting to be certain he truly understood the terms. She had accepted this challenge with a plan of her own, and was determined to ensure everything unfolded according to her wishes. Deep down, she knew Alexander might try to manipulate the situation, but she trusted in her own strength to resist his influence. The meeting ended on amicable terms, with both parties leaving with their roles clearly defined. Isabella would keep her independence, and Alexander would ensure the marriage was nothing more than a formality. But as the days passed and the wedding date approached, Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that this game wasn't as simple as he had first imagined. The wedding took place in a cold, unceremonious manner, like a carefully orchestrated business contract being signed. Alexander Marshall, with his strategic mindset, already saw himself as the winner. He was certain that the 6 months would fly by, and that Isabella, no matter how stubborn, would eventually succumb to the luxurious lifestyle he was about to offer her. Immediately after the ceremony, Alexander took Isabella to his massive penthouse in the heart of Chicago, a monument to his wealth and power. The huge glass windows reflected the city lights, and the interior was a curated collection of expensive and exclusive decor. To him, this was the real battleground, where he would win Isabella over through the sheer force of his material world. But from the very first moment, Isabella made it clear she was not going to back down. As soon as she stepped into the penthouse, she maintained a distant, almost defiant demeanor. The look she gave Alexander was not one of admiration, but of challenge. 6 months, Alexander. Not a day more, she said firmly, walking over to one of the large windows looking out at the city without a hint of being impressed by the luxury that surrounded her. Alexander smiled, confident. He was used to this kind of initial resistance. Every woman who had been in his life eventually bent to his charm and wealth. Isabella would be no different, or so he thought. In the first few days after the wedding, Alexander tried everything to impress her. He showered her with expensive jewelry, designer clothes, and offered luxurious trips, all with the expectation that Isabella would begin to adapt to the lifestyle he dictated. But to his growing frustration, she refused it all. Isabella insisted on sticking to her simple, modest routine, never giving in to the trappings of wealth. "I don't need these things, Alexander," she would say, her calmness only fanning the flames of his irritation. It bothered him deeply. Alexander, who always got everything he wanted, was seeing his authority challenged for the first time. It was no longer just about the bet. Now it had become personal. He had to win Isabella over somehow. He needed to prove that in the end he was the one in control. That's when he started playing more aggressively. He began to interfere with her work, offering reasons like, "You don't need a paycheck anymore," or "Your role is as my wife." When Isabella insisted he would manipulate situations, making her late for meetings she thought were important, Alexander twisted schedules, manufactured problems, anything to maintain control. But Isabella didn't give in. She was a solid rock against his attempts, and that only intensified his desire to break her. Their relationship began to turn into a minefield. Small provocations surfaced in trivial conversations, where Isabella, with sharp and witty words, diffused every attempt Alexander made to make her feel inferior or controlled. On one particularly tense night, Alexander tried a more emotional approach. "I don't understand you, Isabella," he said, staring at her with a mix of frustration and curiosity. "Any other woman would be thrilled to live this kind of luxury, but you act like it's a cage. What do you really want?" Isabella, who had been impassive until that moment, finally lifted her eyes, and they gleamed with an intensity Alexander hadn't expected. "What do I want? I want respect. Alexander, I am not a piece on your chessboard. You think you can control me with money, but you are wrong. Money doesn't buy dignity or integrity. You might have all these things around you, but you're empty inside, and that's what you can't stand." Her words hit him like a physical blow. For the first time, Alexander felt that he might be losing more than just control. Isabella wasn't just resisting his power. She was dismantling the very facade he had built over the years, and that terrified him. No one had ever challenged him like this, and the fact that Isabella saw beyond his wealth made him feel exposed. But instead of backing off, Alexander decided to tighten his grip. He started making plans to isolate her, to make her realize that without him her life would be much harder. He cut off professional contacts, closed doors that could advance her career, and even sabotaged important events she was organizing. However, Isabella wasn't the type to be easily intimidated. With every blow, she stood back up more determined than before. She held on to her dignity, refusing to be shaped by Alexander. And then one night, Isabella played her own card. "Alexander, you think you're in control, don't you?" she said, her tone calculated. "But what you don't know is that I have a plan too. And believe me, when the time is right, you'll see this whole game is built on something much bigger than you ever imagined." Alexander stared at her, surprised. For the first time, he realized he might have underestimated Isabella. And for the first time, he felt the cold fear that in the end, he might not be the winner of this game. The weeks went by like a tightly stretched rope, growing tenser each day, ready to snap. Alexander, in his obsession with control, tried every conceivable way to manipulate the situation to his advantage, but Isabella kept resisting without flinching. She was like a fortress he couldn't breach. Every attempt he made only seemed to reinforce her inner strength. But there was something Alexander couldn't deny. As time went on, he started to see Isabella differently. It wasn't just about respecting her resilience. It was something deeper. She was doing something no other woman had ever done. She was disarming him emotionally, and that made him feel uneasy, confused. For the first time, he found himself thinking of her not as part of a bet or an opponent, but as a person he genuinely wanted to understand. One night, after a particularly heated argument, Alexander found himself alone in the vast living room, staring out at the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The glow of the city lights used to fill him with a sense of power, but now everything felt empty. He wondered why he was feeling this way. Isabella was just a woman he had married for 6 months. She should have been just a piece in his game, nothing more. But the truth was, she was stirring something inside him. He who always controlled his emotions was now being profoundly affected. Isabella could see through his facade, and that made him feel vulnerable. As Alexander wrestled with his thoughts, Isabella carried on with her routine. She seemed more distant each day, almost as if she were waiting for something. Alexander felt like there was an invisible wall between them, something he couldn't break through, and it tormented him. He didn't know if it was pride or the fear of losing control, but something about Isabella drew him in a way he never imagined possible. "You're different, Alex," said Julian, his friend who had proposed the bet during a casual dinner. "Normally you'd have everything under control by now, but it seems like this woman is challenging you in a way no one else has." Alexander gave a forced smile, unable to respond right away. He hated to admit that Julian was right, but it was clear something was changing. That night, Alexander came home determined to settle things. He needed to get Isabella out of his head to remind himself that this was just a contract, nothing more. When he walked into the penthouse, he found Isabella on the couch, reading a book, completely absorbed. "Can we talk?" Alexander asked, breaking the silence that had become the norm between them. Isabella looked up calmly, closed her book, and gazed at him with a serene but attentive expression. "Of course," she replied, as if she had been waiting for this moment. Alexander sat across from her, trying to find the right words. The tension between them was palpable. He knew he couldn't treat this marriage like a simple formality anymore. Something was changing, and he had to face it head-on. "What are we doing here, Isabella?" he asked with a sincerity that even surprised him. "This started as a game, a bet, but I don't know what to think anymore." Isabella stared at him for a few seconds before responding. "I'm not playing, Alexander. I never was." Her voice was calm, but full of meaning. "From the beginning, I accepted this marriage for reasons that go beyond you. I don't care about the money or your control. I'm here for something bigger, and if you haven't realized that by now, maybe it's time to open your eyes." Alexander felt a tightness in his chest. It was as if she were revealing a secret he still couldn't decipher. Frustration consumed him. "I know you have your secrets, Isabella, but what irritates me is that the more I try to understand you, the more I realize I'm not in control. And I hate that," he confessed, suddenly standing up, unable to stay still. Isabella remained calm, watching his every move. She slowly got up and walked toward him, stopping just a few inches away. Alexander felt his heart race. "Alexander," she began, her voice low and soft. "This isn't about control. You've always lived trying to dominate everything and everyone. But with me, you'll have to learn that control isn't always the answer. Sometimes things just need to be what they are." Alexander looked into her eyes, and for a moment he felt a connection he had never felt before. It was as if, for the first time, he was truly seeing Isabella for who she was, not as a piece in his game. "So, what do you want?" he asked, his voice softer now, almost a whisper. Isabella smiled, a mysterious smile that gave him chills. I want you to figure that out for yourself, Alexander. And with that, she walked away, leaving him there alone with his thoughts. In the following days, the distance between them seemed to grow, but in a strange way, Alexander began to feel closer to Isabella than ever before. He was obsessed with figuring out what she was hiding, what her true intentions were. At the same time, he felt like he was losing control of himself. He didn't want to admit it, but Isabella was changing the way he saw the world, and the very idea that she could be affecting him so deeply terrified him. The 6 months of marriage were almost over, but for Alexander Sterling each day felt like an eternity. He could hardly sleep. The looming revelation he felt he was on the verge of discovering made his stomach turn. Isabella had become an enigmatic presence in his life. He thought of her not just as the woman he married on a bet, but as someone who knew something he couldn't grasp. The obsession to understand Isabella consumed him. He had tried everything to uncover the secret she carried, but each answer only led to more questions. Alexander hired private detectives, dug into her past, and followed every lead he could find, but everything seemed carefully orchestrated by Isabella. It was as if she was always 2 steps ahead, controlling the game from the very beginning. One night, after a business meeting, Alexander arrived at the penthouse later than usual. The balcony light was on, and there was Isabella sitting and looking out over Chicago like a queen overseeing her empire. He knew that tonight was when everything would be revealed. He sensed she was ready to tell him what he had been so desperate to know, but the fear of what he might hear made his throat tighten. He walked toward her, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the quiet room. Isabella didn't turn around right away. The air was heavy, almost as if both knew something devastating was about to unfold. I need answers, Isabella. Alexander said, his voice firm, though his heart was racing. I can't take this game anymore. You have to tell me the truth. Isabella sighed slowly and rose from her chair, turning to face him. Her eyes, usually calm and calculating, now shone with an emotion Alexander couldn't decipher. There was something new in her, something dark and fierce. The truth, Alexander. She gave a bitter smile, crossing her arms. Do you really want the truth? He nodded without hesitation, but the tension in the air grew with each passing second. Alexander braced himself for any answer, but nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to hear. You have no idea who I am, Isabella began, her voice carrying a chilling coldness. You've always seen people as pawns on your chessboard, but this time, Alexander, you were the pawn. I've been playing this game from the start. Alexander felt a shiver run down his spine. The certainty he always had about being in control was beginning to crumble. He tried to speak, but Isabella didn't let him. Do you remember the name Rossi? She continued, her voice growing sharper. Of course you don't. People like you never remember. My father owned a small company, one that struggled to survive until you came along and destroyed it. Alexander stepped back, his eyes wide, as his mind raced, trying to connect the dots. What? He stammered, confused. What are you talking about? Isabella took a step toward him, her eyes burning with anger and pain. My father, Alexander. He was an honest man, struggling to support our family until you came along and took everything. You ruined him, Alexander. He lost everything, and it led to his death. Isabella paused, her voice breaking for a moment before she continued, tears welling up in her eyes. My father killed himself because of your empire, your success at any cost. The impact of her words hit Alexander like a punch to the gut. He stood there frozen as fragmented memories slowly resurfaced. There had been so many deals, so many hostile takeovers, so many lives affected by his ruthless ambition. He couldn't remember every company he had crushed on his rise to the top, But now, suddenly, it was all coming back to haunt him. "Isabella," he tried to interrupt, desperate, but she raised her hand, stopping him. "No," she shouted, her anger boiling over. "You have no idea what you caused. It's not just about money, Alexander. It's about destroyed lives. You took my father from me, the only person I had in the world. And while you thrived, my mother and I sank into debt and despair. You lived your life in luxury while we barely had anything to eat." Alexander was completely stunned. He wanted to speak to defend himself, but no words came. All he could do was stand there staring at her as the weight of guilt pressed down on his chest. "But I planned everything." Isabella continued, her tone now more controlled, but still filled with resentment. "When I learned about your bet, I saw my chance. I approached you on purpose. I accepted the bet because I wanted you to feel just a fraction of what I felt. I wanted you to know what it's like to be played, manipulated, and left powerless." Alexander felt his body tremble. He had always thought he was in control, always believed he would come out victorious. But now the tables had turned. He was the target, and Isabella, the player, was controlling the entire board. "Isabella." Alexander began to speak, but his voice was weak. I didn't know. I didn't know you were—" "No, Alexander," Isabella interrupted, stepping closer until she was face to face with him. "You never knew, because you never cared. You destroyed lives without a second thought. And now I'm here not to destroy you, but to make sure you never forget what you did. I want you to feel the pain you caused, and that pain, Alexander, will haunt you for the rest of your life." Her words fell over him like a sentence. Alexander was faced with something he had never experienced before, the real human consequences of his actions. The weight of guilt was crushing, and he knew in that moment he had lost much more than a simple bet. He had lost something he could never get back. Isabella stepped away, the silence echoing through the penthouse. Alexander felt his legs give out, and he collapsed onto the couch, speechless, with no answers. All that remained was emptiness. Isabella's revelation reverberated in Alexander's mind like a relentless thunderstorm. Every word she spoke shattered piece by piece the world he thought he knew. The woman he thought he could manipulate, who he considered just a pawn in his game, had just flipped the entire board. For the first time in his life, Alexander didn't know how to react. For the first time, he was truly out of control. Isabella, however, didn't give him time to process. After dropping the devastating truth about her family's destruction and her father's suicide, she left him alone in the room, abandoned to his own guilt. Alexander remained motionless, the air in the penthouse suddenly suffocating, as if the walls were collapsing in on him. He wanted to talk to her, to apologize, to explain the inexplicable, but the truth was, no words came. How could he justify something so cruel, something that had caused so much pain? In the days that followed, Isabella did exactly what Alexander feared most. She completely ignored him. Her presence was a constant, silent reminder of his failure. She walked past him as if he were invisible, as if his very existence was nothing more than a shadow in a room. At breakfast, she sat in silence, barely lifting her eyes from her plate. When he tried to speak, his words died in the air, unable to break through the wall of ice she had built between them. Alexander, who was accustomed to commanding any room to being the center of attention, was now being erased in his own home. The absence of her attention was an unbearable torture. Isabella spoke to the staff, handled her personal affairs, but with Alexander, it was as if he didn't exist. The weight of this forced silence was slowly destroying the man he thought he was. "Isabella," he tried to call out one morning as she prepared to leave. "We need to talk." She stopped, her back still to him as she adjusted her coat. The silence in the air grew heavier. Alexander waited anxious for some reaction. Any word, even one of anger, would have been better than this profound indifference. But Isabella said nothing. She simply walked out, gently closing the door behind her, leaving Alexander with nothing but the echo of the sound in his mind. The pain of being ignored by someone he was beginning to see as so much more than an adversary was a new and agonizing experience for Alexander. He was used to controlling to winning, but now he was the one being manipulated, punished by silence and disdain. And that was just the beginning. Isabella didn't stop at silence. She began to actively undermine his confidence in small, painful ways. At work, he started noticing that important meetings were being rescheduled without his knowledge. His business decisions were suddenly being questioned by his board, and projects he had initiated mysteriously began to fail. He knew this was Isabella's doing, even if she never admitted it. He felt her influence in every setback, as if she were pulling the invisible strings that held his life together. At home, things grew worse. Isabella adopted a stance of absolute disdain, deliberately distancing herself from any of his attempts at reconciliation. She stopped sitting with him at meals, avoiding any conversation beyond the most superficial. When he followed her trying to fix things, Isabella would respond with cold looks, as if his very presence was an unbearable nuisance. One night, Alexander found her in the living room reading a book. The scene looked peaceful, but he knew that moment of calm was a silent trap. He sat on the couch, trying once again to talk. "Isabella," he began, his voice low, almost pleading. "I know I've done horrible things. I know I've caused you so much pain. But please, can we try to work this out? Can we at least talk?" Isabella slowly closed the book, still not looking at him. When she finally raised her eyes, her face was so cold that it made him shiver. "Talk," she repeated with a bitter laugh. "You think there's something left to say? You want words, Alexander. After everything you've done, words are useless." "I was wrong, Isabella. I know that," Alexander insisted now, getting up from the couch and moving closer, desperate for any kind of connection. "I would do anything to fix what I've done. I can change, I swear." She finally looked directly at him, her gaze piercing as if challenging him to back up his own promises. "Change," she said, standing up slowly. "Do you think changing now will erase everything? Will it bring my father back? Will it fix the years we spent in misery because of you? No, Alexander, it won't." She stepped closer, and Alexander felt himself shrink, crushed by the intensity of her stare. "What you do now isn't for me. It's for you. You'll carry this weight, this guilt, for the rest of your life." Alexander stood in silence. For the first time, he realized there would be no easy redemption, no instant forgiveness. He wanted to fight for something that could be fixed, but the damage he had caused was beyond any simple repair. In the days that followed, Isabella began to increase the intensity of her punishments. At work, a major project he had personally championed was sabotaged from within a disaster he knew she had orchestrated. He came home to find her on the phone, laughing. He overheard fragments of the conversation and realized she was discussing his business failures with a rival. She was destroying everything he had worked for, but in such a subtle, calculated way that no one but him would ever notice. She was making him suffer in silence. When Isabella hung up the phone, Alexander was waiting in the living room. He stared at her, his expression a mixture of exhaustion, repressed anger, and profound pain. "You're tearing everything apart, aren't you?" he said, his voice low but thick with frustration. "At work here, you're destroying my life." Isabella looked at him with an impassive expression, crossing her arms. "Destroying your life?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. I'm just giving back a fraction of what you gave. Don't worry, Alexander. I won't ruin you financially. That would be too simple. I want you to live with the pain. I want you to feel every little loss just like I did. I want you every single day to watch everything you built crumble and know that it is your fault. Alexander felt the ground disappear from beneath his feet once again. It was a waking nightmare. He had always been the winner, always the man who controlled other people's destinies. But now he was the target of a cold and meticulous revenge. Isabella didn't want to destroy him all at once. She wanted him to suffer day by day with every small defeat, every look of disdain, until he had nothing left but regret. Weeks passed, and Isabella continued her campaign of silent punishment. Alexander, once arrogant and confident, now wandered around the house like a shadow of his former self, trying in every way to earn a forgiveness he knew would never come. He was trapped in a cycle of guilt and pain, a cycle that Isabella controlled with perfection. But the worst was yet to come. One night, Isabella finally confronted him, this time with a coldness Alexander had never seen before. She approached him as he sat on the couch, exhausted and broken, and spoke the words that would haunt him forever. "Alexander, you took something from me that I can never get back." She began, her voice calm but sharp as a razor. "Now I am returning the favor, and you will live with that for the rest of your life." And with those words, Isabella left him there, with nothing more to say. She didn't need to. The punishment was already in motion, and Alexander knew he would never be the same. Alexander Marshall felt trapped in a maze of guilt and despair. Isabella had succeeded in making him experience what it was like to be utterly out of control. The weeks following her revelation had been unbearable. Alexander was no longer the confident, arrogant man who believed he held the world in his hands. He was a shadow, a pale reflection of his former self. Every attempt to speak with Isabella was met with cold stares, with rejection. Her indifference was eating him alive. He no longer slept, his mind consumed with trying to fix what he had broken. But something began to change within him. He realized that his words no longer held any value. Apologies meant nothing. Isabella needed to see genuine change, real transformation, and he was willing to do anything to prove it to her. He needed actions, not empty promises. One morning, Alexander woke up with a new determination. He knew he couldn't simply ask for forgiveness. He had to earn it. The first step would be to give Isabella the space she needed. He had to show that he respected her time, that he wouldn't pressure her anymore. But he also knew he had to demonstrate he was still there in subtle but meaningful ways. Alexander began to pay attention to the small things that made up Isabella's life. He observed her daily routines, her preferences, her quiet joys. He didn't follow her, didn't invade her space, but he took mental notes of everything. She loved flowers, especially peonies. Her coffee in the morning was always strong, no sugar. These details, once insignificant, were now the key to his attempt at reconnection. That same afternoon, Alexander went to one of the best florists in the city and bought a bouquet of fresh peonies. He wasn't going to give them to her directly. He knew she would reject them. Instead, he left the flowers on the kitchen table without a note, a simple, meaningful gesture. He waited anxiously. When Isabella returned, she found the bouquet. She didn't say anything, but Alexander watched from the corner of his eye, seeing the exact moment she stopped in front of the flowers. Her expression didn't change, but he noticed her pick up one of the blossoms and gently smell it. It was a small gesture, but for Alexander, it was a sign. She hadn't thrown them out. It was progress. In the days that followed, he continued these small acts of service. He carefully set the breakfast table, making her coffee strong, just the way she liked it, and then left the room, ensuring not to impose his presence. He left little things he knew she enjoyed within her reach, always without forcing a meeting or a conversation. Slowly, he was trying to show that he had changed, that he was paying attention, that he genuinely wanted to care for her. Still, Isabella wasn't giving in. She kept the wall between them firmly in place, and Alexander knew that breaking through it would take time. He wouldn't give up. He was committed to showing her he was different, that he could win her back, but on her terms, and with respect for the space she needed. It was on a particularly cold evening that things began to shift. Isabella was on the balcony wrapped in a blanket watching the city lights. After hesitating, Alexander walked over to her. He brought her a cup of hot tea, knowing she liked to drink something warm before bed. "Here," he said, keeping his voice calm. "I thought you might like something hot." Isabella didn't say anything at first, but she took the cup, her eyes still focused on the city. Alexander stood beside her in silence, simply trying to be present without intruding. The silence between them was tense, but for the first time in weeks, it didn't feel unbearable. It was as if something was changing, however imperceptibly. "Why are you doing this, Alexander?" Isabella finally broke the silence, her voice soft but firm. This was his chance, but he had to be careful. He took a deep breath before responding. "Because I realized that talking doesn't mean anything anymore." He began, looking out at the horizon with her. "My words don't matter. What I did can't be fixed with apologies. But I'm trying to show you that I'm changing. I want to be a better person, not just for you, but because I've realized I need to be." Isabella remained silent for a few more moments, still holding the cup of tea. The cold wind blew past them, but the tension seemed to ease slightly. "You can't change the past, Alexander," she finally said, her voice softer than he expected. "I know," he replied sincerely, "but I can change the future." Isabella looked at him for the first time that night, and Alexander saw something different in her eyes. The hardness was still there, but there was a flicker of curiosity. She wasn't ready to forgive him, he knew that, but this was a crucial moment. He had touched on something she might want to believe in. In the days that followed, Alexander continued his small gestures, but now there was a different energy between them. Isabella still kept her distance, but she wasn't rejecting him as openly as before. She accepted the flowers, the cups of tea, and even allowed him to have brief, superficial conversations with her during breakfast. The barriers were starting to come down ever so slowly. The real test came one evening when Alexander was about to leave for a business dinner. He had dressed ready for another obligatory appointment when Isabella walked into the room with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Can you cancel your meeting?" she asked suddenly. Alexander stared at her, surprised. She had never shown any interest in his comings and goings. He hesitated for only a second before nodding, grabbing his phone and canceling the dinner without a second thought. It was the first time in weeks that Isabella seemed willing to spend time with him, and he wasn't about to miss the opportunity. They sat on the couch, a careful distance between them, but for the first time the silence didn't feel uncomfortable. "I'm not ready to fully forgive you," Isabella said, finally breaking the silence. "But you're showing me something different. I see that you're trying, and maybe that's the beginning of something." Alexander felt his heart race. He knew he couldn't rush things, but her words were enough to keep his hope alive. The road ahead would be long, but he was willing to take every step. The night continued peacefully with the two of them talking about trivial things, but for Alexander, it was a victory. He was slowly rebuilding. Isabella was starting to let her guard down, and Alexander wouldn't make the mistake of underestimating her again. Still, a shadow hung over them. He knew Isabella hadn't revealed everything yet. There was something she was still holding back, and he needed to be prepared to face it. But for now, the fact that she was willing to talk was enough. The weeks that followed that quiet evening were a mix of tension and hope. For the first time, Alexander felt he was making progress. She no longer treated him with absolute coldness, but she also didn't fully open up. There was a hesitation in the air, a kind of waiting that kept him on edge. He knew he was being tested, and he was ready for it. What he didn't know was that something much bigger was about to be revealed. Alexander dedicated himself entirely to proving he was a changed man. He canceled work commitments to spend more time at home, making sure to be available for her without being demanding. Small gestures like making breakfast together or talking about their days in the evening became their new routine. Slowly, the ice between them began to melt. However, something still bothered him. Despite the progress, he felt that Isabella was keeping a secret. She remained reserved at certain moments, avoiding deeper conversations. Then, on a quiet night, as rain tapped against the penthouse windows, he noticed a shift in her behavior. She seemed more introspective, more distant. Finally, when the silence became unbearable, Alexander broke it. "Isabella," he began, his voice low, almost fearful. "I know there's still something you haven't told me. I can feel it. Please, if you're still holding something back, I need to know." Isabella took a deep breath, initially avoiding his gaze. The silence that followed was agonizing. Finally, she looked at him, her eyes reflecting a mix of pain and resolve. "You're right, Alexander. I've been holding something back, something I didn't think I could tell you until now. But maybe it's time." Alexander felt the air tighten. "Do you remember the company you destroyed, the one my father managed?" Isabella began, her tone firm. "I told you that you destroyed our family, and that's true. But that's not all you destroyed." Alexander looked at her confused. "What do you mean?" Isabella lowered her eyes, fighting back the tears that threatened to fall. When she finally spoke again, her voice was a near whisper. "I was pregnant, Alexander." Those words hit him like a crushing weight. He blinked, unable to process what he had just heard. "What?" he whispered, stunned. "I was pregnant at the time when everything happened," she continued, her eyes still fixed on the floor. "And when we lost everything, when my father was gone, the pressure and the stress of it all, I lost the baby." Alexander felt as though the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. He could barely breathe. The guilt that had been consuming him for weeks now seemed to multiply to become an unbearable physical weight. He had destroyed not just a company, not just a family, but also a life that had never had a chance to begin. "Isabella," he tried to speak, but his voice was choked. I never could have imagined." She finally looked at him, and the tears she'd been holding back now streamed down her cheeks. "No, you didn't know," she said, her voice filled with years of hurt and resentment. "Because you never cared to know. You destroyed lives, Alexander, and you didn't even look at the people in your way. I lost my baby, and you went on with your life as if nothing had happened." Her words cut him like knives. He wanted to do something, say something, but knew that nothing could erase what she had been through. I don't have the words." He finally managed, his voice weak with despair. "I know what I did is unforgivable, and I'll never forgive myself for it. But please, Isabella, I would do anything to try and make this right. Anything." Isabella watched him for a long moment, the silence heavy with unspoken pain. Finally, she took a deep breath and closed her eyes. When she opened them again, her expression had changed. The pain was still there, but there was something else, too. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Alexander," she said honestly. "What happened?" It was devastating. But She paused, weighing her next words. I can see that you're trying, and maybe there's a chance that one day I can find a way to move forward. But it won't be easy. It won't be quick. Alexander nodded, feeling a mix of hope and despair. I'll do whatever it takes, he responded, his voice filled with determination. No matter how long it takes, I'll prove to you that I've changed, that I can be someone you can trust, someone you can maybe one day forgive. Isabella looked at him, and for the first time, there was a small opening. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't the end of all the hurt, but it was a beginning. We'll see, Alexander, she said with a soft sigh. We'll see if you can. The silence that followed was heavy but also full of possibilities. Isabella stood up and walked toward the door, leaving him alone, but this time he didn't feel the same despair as before. He knew there was a long journey ahead, but at least now there was hope. The days that followed Isabella's final revelation were transformative for Alexander. Instead of sinking into regret, he decided that the immense guilt would be his fuel for change. He didn't just want to win her love back. He wanted to become a man worthy of her respect and the respect of the many people he had hurt. That morning he made a decision. He would start over, and the first step would be to repair as much of the damage as he could. He began tracking down the families whose lives had been shattered by his ruthless business dealings. His first visit was to the family of an old competitor whose business he had ruined years ago. He arrived unannounced at a modest house a world away from his own opulence. The man who answered the door was a stranger to him, but the pain in his eyes was familiar. I'm Alexander Sterling, he said, his voice filled with a sincerity he barely recognized in himself. I'm here to apologize. The man stared, then laughed bitterly. Apologize? What's that going to change now? I can't change the past, Alexander replied firmly. But I can try to help rebuild the future. I'm here to offer compensation to help fix what I destroyed. Over the next few weeks, Alexander continued this journey of redemption. He knocked on doors, met with families, and offered not just money, but his time and effort to truly understand the impact of his actions. He began donating large sums to small businesses, setting up recovery programs to help other entrepreneurs rebuild. Isabella watched everything from a distance. At first she remained cautious, but as the days passed and she saw a true transformation in him, she began to feel something new, a renewed respect and a flicker of admiration. He was changing, proving his words were no longer empty. One evening she was standing on the balcony when Alexander quietly approached. He had just returned from another reconciliation visit, his expression calmer, more resolute. How was it today? Isabella asked, still looking out at the horizon. Alexander sighed, a sound that carried months of effort and regret. Tough, he admitted, but necessary. Every conversation, every apology. It's a step toward becoming a better person. Not just for you, Isabella. For me too. She finally turned to look at him. There was something different in her gaze. The hardness, the anger she had held on to seemed to have softened. At that moment she saw that he was truly changing. He was no longer the arrogant man who had entered her life with a bet. I can see that, Alexander, she said, her voice soft but firm, and I want you to know that I'm ready to try. Maybe it's time we leave the past behind and build something new. A wave of relief washed over him. Isabella was willing to give them a chance, not as a couple forced together by a bet, but as two people ready to start over. As the 6-month agreement came to an end, something surprising happened. They grew closer. Their conversations became easier, filled with shared moments of laughter and connection. Slowly, love started to blossom in a way neither of them had expected. One night, as the 6-month period was about to expire, Alexander prepared a special dinner. "Isabella," he said, his voice filled with a nervousness he hadn't expected. "I know our agreement is almost over, but I don't want this to end. I don't want us to end. I've fallen in love with you truly, and I want us to continue, but as a real couple. No bets, no games." Isabella looked at him. Her heart warmed by his sincerity. She realized she felt something for him too, something that had quietly grown over the past few weeks. "I love you too, Alexander," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "And I want to try. I want to build something with you, but this time as equals, as a real couple." Those moments were pure happiness for both of them. Months later, Isabella started to notice a change in her body. A doctor's visit confirmed what she suspected: she was pregnant. When she told Alexander, his reaction was pure joy. He embraced her, laughing and crying at the same time. Everything they had gone through, all the pain and heartache, now seemed to lead to this moment of renewal. "I want to do this right this time," Alexander said, knowing exactly what he needed to do. "I want to marry you again, but this time for real. Not because of a bet, but because I love you and want to spend my life with you." Isabella smiled, her tears of happiness mingling with his. "I want that too, Alexander," she replied. "This time a real wedding, a fresh start." Their new wedding was an intimate celebration with a few close friends and family. There was no superficial glamour, just Isabella and Alexander united by a love that had been forged in fire, ready to face the future together. Alexander knew he still had a lot to prove, not just to Isabella, but to himself. But now he had something to fight for: a new life, alongside the woman he loved, and the child they were expecting. As they danced slowly at the end of the ceremony, Isabella rested her head on his chest and whispered, "Who would have thought it all started with a bet?" Alexander smiled, holding her close. "Who would have thought it'd be the best bet I ever made?" And with a future full of love, redemption, and hope, they were ready for the next chapter of their lives.